Who's hiring? Okay, perfect. So now you know who to talk to after my talk. Okay, awesome. Next slide, please. So thank you for coming to the talk, and thank you for Irina for hosting. A little bit about me. So I got my PhD in statistics in 2012. I developed a novel image compression algorithm to learn about two storms on Jupiter. In 2018, Juno mission did a flyby, and it turned out it proved my findings, so that was really exciting. Since I've graduated, I've actually worked in virtually every industry, either as an internal consultant or an external consultant, developing predictive models to learn all about the customers, helping the company scale. And so my talk today is just kind of lessons that I've learned, and hopefully you'll learn in mistakes that won't repeat mine. So we can go to the next slide. So the disclaimer is these are my own personal opinions on what happened. I will take questions at the end. I'll also take statements. I will so the takeaway, or actually motivation, how did this talk come about? So last month at this meetup, Ahmad gave a talk on how do you position a data science team within an organization. So this talk is kind of, now you have a data science team, there's a question that you need answered, so what do you do? And so this is kind of the motivation for this talk. Okay, and so what I found is that it goes something like this. And so hopefully this talk is, teach you how to break that cycle and hopefully make the collaboration easier. If you don't want the next slide, please. Okay, and so what we'll talk about is I'll start out with a few definitions so that everyone's on the same page, and then I'll talk through each step of that cycle to try to improve the way that collaboration is done. Next slide, please. Okay, so executive summary. So key takeaways is always have the business question in mind. Always, learn how your colleagues communicate on different teams, or even within the same team. And then robust code quality, we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the last one is, some things are just beyond your control. So what are some things that, as you're interviewing the company, what should you be asking them? Awesome, okay. So definitions, the first one, proof of concept. My definition would be just the first stab of trying to solve a really big business question. And the way that I would explain a business question, so I taught a UCLA graduate course earlier this year, and I just repeat a business question, and then halfway through the quarter I realized there's a better way to explain it if you've never worked in the industry. And the way that I would explain it is, assume the CEO spent $200,000 on your salary and the data collection. What do they get in return? What's actionable, and how can they make that be $300,000 or $400,000? What do they do based on your recommendation to put that back in the business and grow the business? So I would say, and then my other tip for proof of concept is usually it's based on offline data. It may be data that's collected yesterday, maybe data that's collected months ago, maybe years ago. And then part of the time is going to be spent cleaning up the data or actually figuring out what are the definitions, especially if you're the first one looking at that data, figuring out, oh, it looks like I don't have any missing, but then it turns out that every variable has a missing code in there, and sometimes it's a 99, and sometimes it's a 994, and sometimes it's a -4. Maybe that was my last project. After you figured out what do the variables mean, then a small chunk of that will be developing the predictive model. And then if that looks promising, then we're going to go into production. So my definition for production is it's something that's either internal or external customer facing. So your customer could be a colleague that's using your notebook or your report to find out, well, how are my customers, what are their purchase habits this week? Or it could be a predictive model that maybe triggers a marketing email to send somebody a coupon that they're a high value customer, they're about to churn this week and they really need this coupon to retain them. And I found that about 20% of my time is spent buttoning up the code, and then 80% of that is supporting the model in production once it's live. Slide, please. Thank you. Okay, and then the other thing I need to point out is no code is perfect. There's usually a trade-off between how fast you can ship something and then what the deadline is. So being aware of that and being mindful, you might say, okay, this was really poorly written code, but maybe there was a 2-hour turnaround for that. And then my recommendation would be, as you write code, to have it be reproducible. And so some recommendations are to have virtual environment, package manager, making sure you know what packages went into the code, having version control so that you can rerun the analysis. And then also, probably two key things is documenting what I'm calling the art of data science, that if your outcome is categorical, people will take your word for it, yes, we should use random forest or whatever model. Versus it's much harder when you go, 6 months later to figure out, okay, your outcome was continuous, let's say it was, predicting somebody's yearly purchases, and then you bucket it to figure out what the high value customers were. So figuring out why you chose the buckets that you did is much more important to document. Read me or in the beginning of your notebook, these were the assumptions that I made, this was my business question, so that again, 6 months down the line, you open up the notebook and you go, well, I don't know, what was I doing here? What was the definition? What were the assumptions? I just know I did a random forest and then that's it. And then the other thing is also documenting the input and output. What should the data look like? Is it raw text? Is it some pre-processed text? What format is the output? Are you going to return a 0.75, or are you going to return a churn, or are you going to return a model, maybe a model ID, and a bunch of other things? So being able to, again, when you're looking down the line of what happened, having that documented will help a lot. And then the other thing to note as you're writing any code is if you start, you would think you want to reuse a portion of the code and you want to copy paste, I would say make that a function and then use that multiple times in your code, because then you don't have to maintain or remember, oh, I copy pasted it here and then there and then this other place, and maybe you forgot that it was in this third location. And then as you're testing to make sure that the functionality is there, I would say save that scratch work somewhere else so that when the code is ready for production, you already have something to start writing the tests off because you were just testing the functionality already. And then my last tip is that you're committing stuff to the repo, your notebook. You do the commit, but then also just run all to make sure it all runs, so that you come back 6 months down the line, that runs, or maybe you don't want to come back, it doesn't run, and then again nothing's documented, you don't know what happened, where the data came from, and then it's again much harder to start again. Thank you. Okay, so now that's out of the way, we're ready to do the proof of concept. Cool. Thank you. Okay, so the biggest thing is always is just having again the business question in mind. Why is this project a priority now? Why, there's a lot of different priorities. Why this one, why now? And again, how is this going to be used by the stakeholders? And then the next question will be making sure that you've scoped it down enough, so that, are you looking at 10 years of data? Is that reasonable for a POC? Or maybe it should just be a month. Or, if you have enough data, maybe that should, or, if you have millions and billions of rows, maybe that should be a week, to just see what the trends are, what are the initial thoughts on data on the project. And again, the recommendation is, as you're having these meetings, talk through what is the either the time frame, or what is the category of the customers that you're looking at for this POC. And then of course, I find that it's really helpful to have at least one checkpoint to talk through the stakeholders and the domain experts, so that you get buy-in, you get feedback. Were these assumptions that I made, is that in line with you were thinking? This might be a good time to present the model, start explaining, okay, this is my first stab, what do you think? Does this make sense? And then it's much easier when you're doing the final deliverable, because there's already been a little bit of a buy-in going in. Okay. The other tip is, knowing how everyone communicates. You would be surprised, or probably everyone here, there's probably at least 10 different communication styles. Some people prefer to have meetings on Slack. Once I figured out that that's the preferred preference for my coworker, that made the collaboration much easier than me pinging them to say, oh, well, let's jump on a Zoom call. That was probably the worst thing to ask. And then some people might prefer to do that. And then others might just prefer a really long email to say, these are my assumptions, and then at the end, or maybe highlight, this is my ask, or weigh in here, and that's the best way to collaborate there. And then somebody else might, prefer to go to coffee to talk about it. So that's super helpful to know in the beginning, and again, as you collaborate. And I probably don't have to tell you that it's really hard to do project management for data science. I know a lot of, when I collaborate with clients, it's always, well, when can this be done? And well, it depends on the data. We'll start looking at the data, and then I'll have a better idea of how long things take. And I tend to recommend having a checkpoint of, let's say, okay, let's time box something to, we'll spend this many hours, we'll do a checkpoint, and then we can do a better estimation on what the next step should be. Um, and then the other thing, in case you're not familiar, but it is probably in your contract, I'm pretty sure it's in your contract, the company owns the code. So making sure that, I find that it's much more helpful, much more collaborative to start thinking, well, this is the company's code, this is the team's code, versus this is my code, this is my project. It makes, collaboration that much harder. And then saying, this was a bug in your code becomes much more personal than, hey, we have bugs in our code. Everyone has bugs in their code. And then the other one is, again, thinking back to the business question, should accuracy be the right metric? Probably isn't. There's probably lots of other things, but again, having the business question in mind as you're iterating on the POC would be one other recommendation. Okay, so on the flip side, now you've executed our POC, the stakeholders love it, your code is reproducible, I think we're ready to go. Cool. So now we're ready for packaging up our code to get it ready for production. Okay, so what are some things to watch out for? So your POC is scoped out, but when you're going to production, there's actually a couple of other questions on, well, what should go into production? You probably built a predictive model of some sort, potentially, and there's some data that went along with it. So I would argue to say that the first thing that should go into production is probably a model that you've trained offline and it'll work on live data and then evaluate it. And then maybe the next iteration or the iteration after, you can do a live retraining after you again monitor and see is the model pretty stable from time to time. The other one is, again, just business use case in mind, who's your stakeholder, the last thing you want to deliver is something that's not going to be used. And then this will come up again, but making sure that the teams that you're collaborating with are expecting this collaboration. So you're, packaging up your code, and at some point you'll probably depend on, an engineering team or a DevOps team to actually press the button to put it into production. Making sure that they're aware when that time frame is going to happen, and getting on their calendar as soon as possible will go a long way to making sure there's less delays. And again, this will be something, during checkpoints, bringing that up with the team as well. And then the other thing to note is, okay, our model is going to be in production, and I would recommend rolling it out to only a percentage of traffic. So 5%, 10%, not to everyone, so that you can see, okay, is it working as expected? Is the performance better or worse? What's happening? And being able to have that functionality in place will also go a long way to making sure that the models are improving over time. So again, this is a discussion to have, make sure that the goals are aligned across the organization to be able to have that in place. Okay. So as I mentioned before, I have a really hard time estimating how long projects take, and I found, as I mentioned, one is having those checkpoints. The other thing, the other approach would be somebody is really pressing to say, okay, well, how much do we estimate? Maybe then flip it around to say, what if we spend this many hours and then see what happens, and then having a Google Doc in place with questions or concerns of, hey, I'm assuming this variable means this. Is this in line with what you were thinking? So on and so forth. And then a couple of things on the production environment. So again, we're packaging up our code, it's getting ready for production. What happens if there's no production? So until a year ago, I used to ask, prospective client, or if you're interviewing, do you have a production environment, assuming, and then machine learning? So the answer was yes, but they would have a production environment, for instance, for their app. So now I actually ask arguably a better question, which is, how do you get something into production? And then they can tell you about all those steps. So if it doesn't exist, there's actually a couple of ways that you can build your own production environment. So AWS, and there's a couple of other software providers that, AWS SageMaker, for instance, you can package up your model, create the API, and then the app can actually query the API to get the result. Again, then it'll be live in production. On the flip side, if the production is getting built out, again, knowing what that timeline is will go also a long way to figuring out, okay, is my deadline, I know my deadline's in a week, but if production's not ready for a month, should I really push to have it be done this week? Again, conversation for the whole team. Awesome. Okay, so then the other thing is you have this code, and I found, I say arguably good, that if you've worked in potentially poorly written code, again, because somebody probably had really pressing deadlines, what I've learned is that my code actually gets better because you've debugged so many things that you know what not to do later. And then the same thing for, code reviews. I've typically had 0 or 1 people review my code. One time I had 4, and I learned a lot more about the art of software development that I think I would have used otherwise. So just having a lot of people weigh in was really helpful, actually. And then there is an art and a science to code review. I couldn't find, honestly, a good reference here to say, okay, what should be the way to do it? So I think that's also up for discussion. But there's a lot of different purposes for a code review. Sometimes it's, the code. How does the code look? Does it actually run? Some other times it's, does it do the things that you expect? And part of it is scientific review. And sometimes it's, okay, you just code reviewed somebody's code, and if that person's on vacation, you're actually going to be the maintainer, which is, a lot of different things to cover at one point, which are things to watch out for. Okay? But our code looks good, we're following best practices, there's lots of other best practices, and you change from time to time. I would say having informative error messages. I think the first error message I ever wrote was error something went wrong. 5 minutes later that got triggered, so I don't do that anymore. Having logging, so that what that means is it'll capture every line in your code as it's running, so that if something breaks, you know which lines got executed and which didn't, and it helps you debug and step into a portion of the code that broke. I also have a reference. This is I gave a talk maybe 2 months ago on how do you write a testing suite for machine learning models. This is if this is your first one. How do you go about refactoring code? What's a unit test? What's an integration test? So on and so forth. So that's there. And then this cookie dough is actually more, a little bit more on the DevOps side, but if you end up doing everything yourself, or you're doing the data analysis, data science, you're doing the deployment, and some things are, you might end up doing the same things over time, or they're templated. So cookie dough is kind of a template to help you do that. A couple of jobs ago, one of the DevOps engineers developed this for us. But this is an open source template that you can tailor to your needs, so that later you can follow along to say, okay, well, this is what my Docker image looks like. These are the folders for the unit or for the testing suite. So every deployment looks similar. That would be a recommendation, and then your code's packaged up, and then you're ready for production. Okay. So ideally, this will be a one-button push, but some things might come up. So again, remember, if your team's not aligned, you might be ready, they're not. So when do you get on somebody's calendar to do that one-button push and then doing the monitoring? The other thing is, again, if they're building it out, it might not be ready. So making sure, again, when that will be ready is key. And then the one thing I've seen is that, okay, maybe you've been waiting for 2 weeks, and your boss doesn't know you've been waiting for 2 weeks, and you'll come back and say, okay, our deadline is tomorrow, but I've actually been blocked for 2 weeks. That's probably the wrong time to say that. So I would say as soon as you start getting blocked, maybe the next day or the day after, talk to your collaborators, talk to the team, find out what is that process, so that either you work on something else, or you find out what is the priority again. So the alignment is really key here. Okay, awesome. So now our code is in production, our stakeholders are ready, you probably learned a lot. And then now we're going to talk about post-production. Okay, so our code again is live. And then, thank you. So one thing you might find out is how do different companies handle when things go wrong. And so my one tip is, again, when you're interviewing or when you're doing a kickoff or planning, is to ask, hey, if a deliverable didn't meet your expectations, what do? You find out about a lot. And then, of course, do you have alerts if something's not working? I had a model in production for a week. It ran locally, and it didn't work in production, and we didn't know because there were no alerts and there was no monitoring. So now I know to have that in place as well. And then the other thing that I would recommend is after every model deployment is to have a postmortem. So it's kind of either a meeting or a check-in to see what worked, what didn't work, what would you prefer to change for next time. And if your team doesn't do that, I would recommend either starting that, or I do that with my own projects where I either or take the client out and say, hey, give me feedback. What worked? What didn't work? What should we do? And I also check in to see after I deployed something, what could I have changed for next time? How could I have communicated better? What could I have done differently? Another thing is, will be really bad, right? If your model's in production and then nobody's using it. So again, coming back to the stakeholders and asking why. What was missing? Is it just the format? Is there something else? What was the key thing that is stopping you from using this model? And And then this is one thing that, maybe your model's doing amazing and it's generating a lot of money, and then the expectation is, okay, but now generate twice as much more money in a shorter amount of time. So again, managing expectations is really key. And then, something's in production, it's live, things may break, so figuring out how the team handles support. Is it round robin? Are you the only one? It's your model, your code, you're maintaining it, is a big question. And then, of course, are you tracking and prioritizing bugs over features? Cool. So your model's in production, customers are happy, your product's better. So I want to say thank your collaborators and celebrate. And slide. And summary, of course, as we talked about, the key is business question, figuring out how everyone communicates, code quality, and then figuring out how does your company align on the collaboration and the communication aspect. Are there any questions? Sure.
How do you decide whether to go for a simple heuristic-based, code, or predictive model for a problem?
Sure. So the question is, how do you decide between a heuristic versus a predictive model? So I would stress, that's a very good question. So I personally would stress going with a heuristic first, which is probably not what a lot of people want to hear. But as long as you have a simple baseline, it's much easier to then compare performance with a predictive model to say, oh, we're doing 2x better than a heuristic, or actually we're doing just as well, and then you may not need the predictive model.
I just echo one of the recurring themes in your talk. I think my background's in gaming, video gaming, and the last two studios I was with, we completely failed to take advantage of our data science capabilities. I think because of some of the pain points that you identified here. And unfortunately, the onus, in a lot of ways, is on data scientists to help the organization figure out how best to leverage their expertise. And I think probably they carry that burden more so than, say, their peers in other engineering-related disciplines. So it's an unfortunate kind of reality of the times. I think over time, if data scientists can demonstrate that they're strong advocates for how best to use their talents, what the right way is to integrate teams, how to manage stakeholders' expectations of their work and their output. Maybe that problem will go away, but unfortunately, I feel like it's a big thing right now. And so I'm glad you went into so many places where you have seen it go not so well.
Oh, no worries. 1 second. If you don't mind going to the next slide. So for one thing, for references, I highly recommend the first on their ASPER framework. So it's a framework developed by a couple of people that run different consulting centers or in academia, but it's how do you ask better questions, how do you work with collaborators, how do you have a successful meeting, and I highly recommend looking there as well.
So this presentation is very much like operational focused data scientists, like deploying a model to production to automate some action, like you mentioned the coupons, whatever. But obviously there's a whole other side of data science, which is like the exploratory portion. And I guess to your point of like the business question and like the proof of concept piece, something that I personally have been finding really difficult in the exploratory phase of the data science part of the job is a lot of the business requesters will just essentially keep on asking why indefinitely. And the problem with why questions is they never end, right? Because like you can always ask why. And so my question is like, when you had to deal with that situation, I guess how did you deal with it? Like, because of course I've tried to set expectations and tried to push my business request to say, listen, like we're already at a point that we have actionable insights, like let's go, like, and I still have difficulty. So like how do you deal with that?
That's a good question. So what I found now is, I would say my recommendation is to almost ask, well, why are you asking that? What is missing? What are you looking for? Is it not answered? I mean, I've seen that a lot with a dashboard, right? You develop a dashboard and you say, oh, look, this is what's happening, and then there'll be something interesting. You say, okay, let's dive deeper into that.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's dive deeper into that other thing. And then, you can just keep digging until there's probably like one person left. So then the question becomes, I would say, once in part either that's exhausted or maybe halfway through to see, what is, why that interest. And I think hopefully that'll help.
So one of the issues my team's having is we have a lot of models we built that are tested, they're ready to go, but they've been sitting on the shelf collecting dust. And so what do you do in this situation? I didn't realize how much of data science is sales and trying to sell this to stakeholders what you've done and how it will impact business. But what do you do when a model is sitting on the shelf for months and you know it's going to be impactful? How do you get the engineers or the team to get on your side and implement it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Some of the questions. Yeah, if the model's been sitting around for a while, how do you get that into the business? So I would say kind of 2 or 3 things. One is I recommend if there's a way to get data science into the high-level meetings, somebody from your team to go into, talk about that just from the beginning to say, hey, we have this. That would help. The other one would be, part of it could be also then figuring out why are they staying on. Is it the priorities? Is the data engineering team? Is it the production's not built out? Is it in a different format? I don't want to go use the AWS SageMaker and create the APIs, and that is a solution potentially. But I would also again try to figure out on the project priorities of just why is that not happening? Because maybe you need a stakeholder in terms of maybe you do a demo to you go to the other team and say, hey, I have this model, this can help you. Maybe they'll become your advocate. There's a lot of, I think part of it is the cross-team collaboration that may or may not be missing. Hopefully that helps.
In general, how much time do you and your team spend in each of those 4 phases?
The POC post-production?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'd say if you don't mind going back to, I think, I forget, it was maybe like slide 3 or 4. Yeah, right here. So I would say that the percent estimate is probably 90% cleaning, 10% modeling, 20% packaging it up, and then support. Having said that does depend, whether you're in a full-time role, consulting role. It really depends. I think a big part of my time, which is not even here, is meeting with potential executives and asking them what is they'll have a bunch of projects, what is the priority, or helping them with a priority. And so once that's prioritized, then to go in and do that. But yes, it really, 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 unfortunately, does depend on the project and how clean the data is and the use case.
Cool.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Irina. And thank you for referencing all of the memes you posted. I think that is very thorough research, and I appreciate it. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Thank you to Mike and Irina and Joe for coming up here and speaking. I guess at the beginning, we couldn't do this without you guys coming. I hope you had a good time. This ends the formal part of the meeting, but we'd love if you guys could meet up, talk to these people about causal inference, about how to set up a data project. I think we may have eaten all the pizza, that's a good sign, but please stick around as long as you want. Thank you again for coming, and round of applause to yourself.
Thanks, Adam.
Yeah, no, thank you. That stuff is crazy.
What?
The X learners and the T learners and stuff like that. It's like a whole new way of processing